General Vandergrift was greatly concerned over the wretched performance of Marine patrols. This was due to the general lack of liaison between units, which was complicated by the total inability of their fishpole aerials to transmit in the jungle. My scouts had been stalking the enemy for some months, so I was able to show the Marines a thing or two. I taught them how to rig a reliable alternative aerial, something I had learned by bitter experience. Soon I was in charge of extended patrolling. Our information was confused, but everything pointed to the fact that the Japanese had been trying to land reinforcements. It was vital to find out what success they had had. On 19th August, I sent Vuza to gather some men for a patrol round the rear of our perimeter from the eastern side to identify suspected enemy positions spotted in the bush, while Daniel Poole and 3 other scouts went out as guides with an offensive force of about 60 men under Captain Charles H. Brush, Jr., to see what could be found to the east along the coast. By that time it was noon. There was no hope of getting back to D2 for lunch, so we sat and had a bar of chocolate on the beach, at the mouth of a sluggish stream that on the marine maps was marked Tenaru River, but in peacetime had been known as Alligator Creek. There was definitely something in the air, and as I looked out over the channel I felt a cold shiver down my spine. There, in broad daylight, Japanese destroyers were shelling Tulagi. We got ready to move as one started to come across to Guadalcanal. Suddenly, however, 3 flying fortresses appeared. They scored a direct hit, and we were greatly relieved to see her hobbling off to the west, burning merrily. When we got back to D2, things really started to happen. Info poured in from all directions. Judging by Coast Watcher's reports, enemy planes were everywhere, and one of the destroyers I saw had stood in close to shore and signaled the Japanese beyond the Mataniko. Daniel and Vura, one of the scouts, came back with Captain Brush. Near Volanavua they had run smack into 25 enemy soldiers who had just landed in small boats, evidently from the destroyers. The patrol had dispatched 18 of them, but the other 2 scouts and 1 Marine who were on the flank were missing. Daniel was scared stiff, but he had been remarkably observant in noting Japanese equipment. The ambushed patrol had lots of radio gear. Captain Brush thought it was but 1 platoon from a much larger unit, sent down to retake the airfield. Now the situation had become precarious, and the division was immediately put on standby. If the Japanese could land troops at will, we should have a fair war on our hands at any minute. Out of the frying pan and into the fire, I thought sadly. I had exchanged my little pistol for a Colt .45, and intended to give a good account of myself, if need be. I hoped none of my scouts would be caught unawares. As we waited for something definite to happen, everyone was very much on edge. I had my hands full laying out the coast, watching setup and call signs for the Marines on watch at D2, so they could properly interpret and enter on the maps the information coming in through Mackenzie's center. The only snag was that McFarlane and the rest took it for granted that the Americans knew the local place names. The Marine maps at this stage were little more than charts, and I was constantly being called in to identify new names. I also had to go down to the perimeter when scouts arrived to identify my men and get the information as quickly as possible. This took time, bounding across country from one shell hole to another. Next morning, in addition to several false air raid alarms, we suffered the indignity of having 2 Japanese cruisers steam up and down the channel, quite close in, and throw in the odd shell from time to time. Vuza went off on his patrol, while Daniel prepared to go out, again with Brush and his commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard B. Cresswell, whose whole battalion was moving out to the attack. The sharpness of 6 samurai swords that had been brought in led me to reflect how lucky I had been, up till then. The afternoon was spent down at the prison compound. Our prisoners, mostly from construction units, were scruffy-looking but sturdy little men. I helped Captain Moran to interrogate them and to decipher the Japanese operations maps. Seeing Viv Hodges on my way back, I complained that since I had joined the Marines I had not been able to take off my boots at night. He then told me of an amazing episode on the previous day, in which he had escaped death or serious injury only because he did not have his boots on. When the shelling started in the early hours of the morning, he had darted for his foxhole, only to stub his toe on a tent peg and measure his length on the ground. While he lay there, swearing, there was a tremendous explosion, and an incoming shell sheared off a coconut tree directly above his head. The men who had been sleeping on either side of Hodges had kept their boots on. One was gravely wounded, the other annihilated. They had got twice as far as he had, but they were erect and running as the shell exploded. About 4 p.m., while returning from the prisoner's cage, I heard a distant sound. It became a drone, and then the drone became a roar as a squadron of dive bombers and another of fighters swept over, circled, and landed. Our own planes at last. When I got back to D2, Michael, who had not felt too happy during the night shelling, was wreathed in smiles. Through my binoculars I could see Marines in their bedraggled dungarees rushing out to welcome the pilots. It was indeed a gladsome sight, and gave me a tingle right down the spine. This was but a momentary relief, and I still had that queer feeling that something was about to happen. But now, at least, we were in a position to hit back for a change. We turned in uneasily that night. No one seemed to think we would get much sleep. Sure enough, after several alarms, Colonel Cates received word about 2:15 a.m. that his outposts had been withdrawn in the face of large numbers of the enemy. Coming as it did from the east, this attack meant that the Japanese had landed a large enough force to give them sufficient confidence of success in attacking our positions. Everyone was soon on the alert, and about 2:30 a.m., heavy machine gun fire broke out on Cates' line. I turned uneasily and looked toward the Matanikau, wondering what the Japanese were doing there. But all was quiet in that vicinity. As the enemy attacked across the Tenaru River, the staccato of the machine guns increased and became interspersed with rifle fire. The firing grew so intense that one could almost distinguish chords in the weird, horrible music of battle. Contact reports kept coming in, and at 3:50 a.m., Cates reported that he was committed all along his front. New sounds were heard, the thud of mortars. And then, about 4:30 a.m., our artillery. There were also enemy support weapons, which were as yet unknown to us. Tracers ricocheted up into the sky, together with red and white flares as Japanese columns came into the attack. We could see the coconut palms silhouetted in pink flashes, and, in that strange light, debris being thrown heavenward. Everything appeared to be going all right, but it all seemed dangerously near, and as the din increased I had the eerie feeling that the battle was creeping closer. The tracers seemed to dart right across the airfield. Dawn broke. Then, just before 7 a.m., when the coconut palms became green again above the holocaust below, I got an urgent telephone call that a native, mortally wounded, had staggered through the enemy lines and was repeatedly asking for me. They could not get much information from him, as he was wounded all over the front of his body and his throat was full of blood. Grimly I grabbed the jeep and rushed down to the front with Daniel Poole. The noise got louder and louder, and I heard bullets thwacking into the coconut trees. We managed to get to Colonel Pollock's command post, which was but 100 yards from the raging battle at the river line. Here we found the dying native. It was Vuza. He was an awful mess, and unable to sit up. I could hardly bear to look at him. We dragged him behind the jeep, and there, in spite of a gaping wound in his throat, he told me his story as best he could. On his patrol, Vuza had taken a miniature American flag given him as a souvenir. He tried to hide it at Volanavua, but the area was thick with enemy troops, and he barely got away. Near Makeel, Vuza approached what he thought was Captain Brush's patrol, only to find that it was the Japanese patrol later ambushed by Brush's Marines. Caught red-handed, he was hauled before the regimental commanding officer, Colonel Ichiki. Ishimoto, who interpreted, recognized him. He was brought to Gaimalay and left in the sun, tied by straw ropes to a tree. But he would not divulge our dispositions. The soldiers smashed his face with rifle butts, slashed him with a sword, and made him lie on a nest of red ants. Still he did not answer. They then hung him in a tree until he passed out from wounds and exposure. At dusk they took him down, tied his wrists, and moved into position for the attack, taking him with them. When the attack began, Vuza's guards were ordered to dispatch him. Since shooting would give away their position, they bayoneted him repeatedly and left him for dead. Vuza received 7 wounds in his chest and another, the biggest of all, in his throat. As the battle unfolded, he staggered away and managed to bite through the cords that bound him. He must have walked or crawled nearly 3 miles, right through the battlefield. At the Marine outpost, Private Wilbur F. Bewley of Company G, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, saw that he was not a Japanese, but on our side. As if that were not enough, Vuza insisted on spluttering out to me a very valuable description of the Japanese force, its numbers and weapons. This was passed on immediately. A bullet hit the jeep as I lay behind a tree telephoning it in. Vuza, who had lost pints of blood, was in terrible shape. He fully expected to die, and before he passed out again he gave me a long last message for his wife and children. I wrote with one hand and held his hand with the other. Once he had done his duty, the terrific strain told, and he collapsed. We carried him back and got the doctors operating on him. They pumped Vuza full of new blood, and amazingly it was expected that he would live, if, that was, the hospital was not disturbed by air raids. What loyalty the man had! I felt immensely proud. Shortly afterward, Billy, one of Vuza's patrol, came in with a bayonet wound in his arm. A lad of 14, he too had been tied up by the Japanese, but Vuza told them he had not been to the Marine lines, and he was let go. The boy was so scared that I got very little out of him, but he did corroborate Vuza's story. Billy had counted 300 or 400 Japanese at Makile, some with twigs and leaves on helmets and uniforms in battle camouflage. By the time I got Vuza squared away and attended to, and dealt with a multitude of other problems, it was about noon. The battle was still in full swing, and our newly arrived fighters drove off some Zeros that had come in to support their infantry. A prisoner from the Tenaru front, interrogated by Captain Moran, said that he had walked up the coast for 2 nights in a party of 200. This added to our knowledge of the enemy landings. I called on Colonel Cates, whom I found very direct but easy to talk to. Cates had the air of an experienced soldier, cool, calm and collected. He wore breeches and knee-length campaign boots and nonchalantly smoked cigarettes from a long black holder. When I had first met him, he had seemed nervous and fidgety and apt to imagine snipers in every tree. When the heat was on, however, he was really at home, and quite a different man. There was no doubt he was a bonny fighter. The colonel was quite pleased with the operation. He was about to swing Cresswell's battalion on his right flank and cut Ichiki off to the sea. About 4:30 p.m., just as some of our planes flew back in, the din suddenly stopped and the fight was over. Afterward, I went down to the shore with our photographers and equipment experts to glean what we could about the Japanese. This was my first view of a real battle, and I must say I was appalled. Never had I seen such terrible destruction occur in such a short space of time. There were 700 or 800 dead strewn in bits over about 3 acres. The fighting had been at very close quarters, and our 37mm guns, firing canister shot, had done ghastly work. One of Lever's cows had unfortunately wandered into the scene and, in the confusion of the night fighting, had been eliminated by a Japanese flamethrower. On the beach, close to where so recently we had sat and eaten chocolate, those who had attempted to creep behind our lines were being covered up by sand carried in by the sea. I found the sweet smell of death quite revolting, but Michael and my scouts were frightfully pleased. They understood this sort of thing. We had great difficulty with marine souvenir hunters as we searched for maps, orders, and the like, and had to clear the area of sightseers. Some of the enemy, shamming death, turned over slyly and lobbed hand grenades. They were soon dealt with. The Japanese were extremely well equipped, especially with wireless, signal gear, even bicycles, and we brought back plenty of work for Captain Moran and his interpreter team. It had been an eventful day, and even if an ammo dump had not exploded that night, I would not have slept for thinking of those ghastly bodies. The next day we all worked like beavers getting the museum sorted out and testing some of the Japanese apparatus. Wireless sets, mortars, machine guns, even intact flamethrowers were captured. Between times I managed to go down to see Vuza. His condition was improving, but he was still very weak. He could hardly be seen for the bandages. I was also pleased to get a message from McFarlane that Gumu and Beato, the scouts who had gone missing on the brush patrol, had turned up safe. So much for the Battle of the Tenaru. Our own casualties were small compared to those of the Japanese. I was sent to take some Japanese equipment to show to Colonel Hunt and to bring back a prisoner from his sector. As a result, I missed the afternoon meal again. Somehow I never seemed to be near the kitchens at chow time, but I was so used to going hungry that I did not worry much about missing meals, which in any case were pretty scanty. I managed to do a little trade, however, and returned triumphant with a case of Japanese beer for the thirsty souls at D2. I was still worried about Vauza and about Ishimoto. I felt that as long as he was loose, all my scouts were in danger. During the day, 3 scouts who could identify him had combed the battlefield for Ishimoto, but there was no sign of the man amongst the dead. We should have to look for him at Taivu. Until the end of the month, the Japanese kept up their air and sea offensive. For now, they did not make another large-scale effort on land. They just worried our perimeter and kept us all awake. Their air raids increased in number and size, and though our air force was gradually reinforced, it did not make very much difference in the number of bombs that were dropped on us. On 23rd August, following several raids, 8 Zero fighters zoomed in to strafe the airstrip at about 200 feet. One came straight at us, diving down a gully between the Ak pits. As the bullets hit the ground, a line of dust slewed past our shelter. Colonel Buckley, who was still outside, carried out a wonderful acrobatic wriggle apparently without using his arms or his legs. He only just beat the bullets inside. Though partially under cover, I was so fascinated by his evolution that I remained rooted to the spot and was covered by small stones. Most evenings a cruiser or destroyer would play lights out, with a dozen or so salvos clanging onto the airstrip. Or, as it had been renamed, Henderson Field, after a gallant Marine dive-bombing squadron leader, Major Lofton R. Henderson, who had been lost at Midway. For the most part, the shells were aimed at the airfield, but sometimes the Japanese waggled the spout a bit too much, and they fell about our ears in D2. The CBs were kept pretty busy maintaining Henderson Field, as there were 2 or 3 new holes on the runway practically every morning. I felt sorry for our pilots, who had flown in from carriers and had no bedding or equipment. They were handed a rifle and a spade, and in many cases they had to sleep in foxholes that they dug near their planes. Our dive bombers began to get their eye in, and over the next few days managed to damage or sink several destroyers and cruisers. The pilots soon realized that everyone sunk meant a better chance of a night's rest and more planes to fly the next morning. More fighters had arrived, including some queer things called Aerocobras. They looked quite flimsy next to the sturdy soapbox Grumman Wildcats. 14 flying fortresses had also landed. But our ground staff was very browned off with these birds of passage because they used such a lot of fuel in return for their alleged accomplishments. All our fuel, then and for months afterward, came in 50-gallon drums, which had to be manhandled ashore. One air raid that I shall never forget occurred on 25th August, under a cloudless sky. I was sitting down at the pen, listening to Colonel Buckley and Captain Moran questioning prisoners, when suddenly, for no reason at all, I looked up and there, floating in the blue haze, were 21 Bettys in a perfect V, like moths flickering in candlelight. The Japanese had come over at 28,000 feet to evade our anti-aircraft guns. We ducked off our camp stools and threw ourselves into a wide-open ditch, only a little faster than the prisoners. We had just hit the dust when the ground shook and swayed under the weight of heavy bombs. They fell all round the airfield and round where we were crouching. Though not much damage was done, several men were annihilated or wounded. The next day, Japanese bombs became almost a personal matter at D2, 3 men being annihilated within a few yards of us and some ammunition blowing up close by, touched off by a delayed action bomb. The bomb flung a piece of iron through the stove of the general's cook, Sergeant Butch Morgan. Butch, who was of Welsh extraction, was furious. The air was blue for miles around with his expressions of love for the Japanese. This time, however, the Grummans blew a number of Bettys and Zeros to pieces, and several others were barely able to limp home to their base at Rabaul. In between interrogating scouts, sending out patrols, elucidating other Coast Watchers' messages, and trying to identify place names from prisoners, I managed to fit in a daily visit to Vuza. The hospital must originally have been one of the Japanese administrative buildings. It was raised off the ground and built of the very same bedboards we slept on, with a roof of native palm leaves. But it had little or no protection from the air, and the original signal headquarters at one end had been smashed to smithereens. Mackenzie having a lucky escape, some wag had put a notice outside. 3,660, 6, or was it 3,686 miles to Tokyo? Vuza's vitality was amazing. By now he was sitting up in his cot, swathed in bandages and usually smoking a large cigar. He had become the centre of attention at the hospital and would tell his story to each admiring visitor. The doctors, with great modesty, said he had the constitution of an ox, but I think they did him proud. A layman, at any rate, would hardly believe that he had nearly been dead a few days before. At the worst, his rich copper colour had faded to a deathly pale green, and although he had lost a lot of weight, he had begun to regain a healthy flush. My scouts were busy trying to find out what had happened to any enemy survivors after the Battle of the Tenaru and what went on across the Matanikau. McFarlane had reported that some of the lads were afraid to bring in reports as the Japanese had blocked the roads. I could not really blame them. On 27th August, however, Vura and Tabasui came in, with letters from Mac and several civilians. MacFarlane had suggested to Mackenzie that the latter send him a few tins of meat or other tinned stuff, suitable for the high living standard to which I have been accustomed for the past few months. In fact, he joked in a later signal, the house cats do not realize the danger they are in. The story was the same all over. In a cheery letter, Campbell wrote, "Well, here we are again, all the happy party. After 6 weeks' sojourn at the health resort on the Suta, I put in one of the weeks there, on my back, with a poisoned leg, and was only 2 days up when I made the trip back. I think Mac and Ken have both written you about our Kaikai position, and have asked you if you can do anything for us in that line with the powers that be down there. We are really down to pretty short commons in all lines for ourselves, and my Makira San Cristobal and Ulawa labour are causing me quite a lot of worry of how to feed them." He also mentioned that Andresen and Freshwater had opened their last tin of meat. Mackenzie made a tremendous fuss about the food shortage. Apart from the fact that MacFarlane now had Hay and Campbell at Bombardejo with him, they had all lost so much every time they had moved that they really were pretty hungry. It took a lot of persuasion and complicated arrangement, but I managed to organise and deliver, that same day, the first airdrop of the campaign. There were no proper containers or parachutes for dropping supplies, so we wrapped up tins of sea ration stew, cigarettes, and atabrine, and stowed them in Japanese straw bags. I could not make the parcels too big, nor could I take very much, as I had to get all of it, and myself, into the rear cockpit of a dive bomber. For a start, I was scared stiff. Apart from the fact that it was the first time I had ever flown, I could not hear a word of what Major Mangrum, the pilot, said through the intercom. I hoped we would not meet any hostile aircraft, as I had not really mastered the tail gun. I was quite astonished when we found Gold Ridge. It looked very small, and Mount Tatuva, a neighbouring peak, got in the way for low flying, against the green grass and surrounding bush. However, I soon picked up MacFarlane of the Glens, in gleaming navy whites set off by his black beard. As we zoomed over on each of our 3 runs, I stood up, facing backward, and dropped a bag. I very nearly followed the first one out. Bump, down went each bag, slowly turning over and over until it hit the ground and bounced. One of them burst and another narrowly missed Mac, but the shooting was not too bad, and it was jolly funny watching him dodging his dinner. We got home without enemy interference. Mac wired that he had collected the bags, but quite a lot was mangled. He was busy scraping stew off the cigarettes and his uniform. I also heard from Father Engberink at Ruavatu. He had got the impression that I had accused him of collaborating with the enemy. He protested that, in fact, the Japanese had ordered the local people to work for them for 1 month and had threatened to shoot them if they refused. How, he wrote, could he tell them not to go? What I had blamed him for was lack of common sense in not letting the islanders at his settlement disappear into the bush, where they would have had no opportunity to either obey or disobey the Japanese. Enemy soldiers had called at his station 3 times and subjected him to questioning. I was relieved when he noted that the troops had been very polite and had never asked the missionaries or the locals where I was. All they took was his shotgun, his wireless receiving set, and his camera. Clary Hart, at Kauko, had not realized that anything more than a heavy bombing attack had taken place. In a letter, he described in detail the adventures of the Japanese at Marau and how they had tied up and questioned the fathers and brothers at Makina. What worried him most was the way in which the local people, together with, so he claimed, 2 of my policemen, had looted his belongings and stores while he was in the bush. Hart had hardly had time to digest my letter, but he was wildly excited about it, and wished that he had someone and something with whom and which to get drunk. Good old concrete Clary. As regards the incident at Makina, I eventually got the full story in a letter from Father Boudard, who happened to be at Marau at the time. Some Japanese barges from Bokoagao had been bombed when they were near Marau on 8th August. A Japanese shore party then had called at Makina and accused the missionaries of being in league with the Allied forces. Father Boudard's charmingly vivid account reads best in its original French, but this English translation by Brother James Thrift conveys some of the flavour of his recounting of this episode. My dear Mr. Clemens, I am taking the liberty of writing to tell you what happened at Marau. You no doubt already know the main outline, but not perhaps the full details of the story. The Japanese first appeared on Wednesday the 5th, immediately after their visit to Makina. Their visit to us was much the same as previous ones to other stations. Our arms and radios, etc. were seized, but otherwise nothing unusual happened. At about 5 o'clock on the morning of Saturday, the 8th, some 30 fully equipped soldiers commanded by Captain I. Ishimoto, again climbed the hill. Old Father Jean Koiko, who is 68, went out to meet them. Some of the soldiers immediately bound his hands behind his back, whilst others entered the house. They found the other father, that is, Van Mechelen, dressing and bound him in the same way. Then they led the two venerable prisoners like that to the brethren, who were taken by surprise as they were getting out of bed. They too were seized and bound like the fathers. Then they were all taken out and tied to pillars on the veranda. The Japanese then threatened us fiercely, pointed their revolvers at us, banged their swords on the table and finally started their questioning. 1. You have a secret wireless and transmitter and have revealed our position to the Americans. Then followed a minute search everywhere. One of the brothers said very politely, Yes, we have a wireless, but it does not work. You could have taken it the first time you came, but you did not ask for it then. And we have not hidden it either. Open this cupboard and see for yourselves what condition it is in. But we certainly have no transmitter. 2. You sent out signals one night with very lights? The brothers pleaded, Not guilty. 3. You looted Paruru after the white man left. The brethren asked permission to look in a drawer and produced a letter written by Mr. Hodges, proving that the things he left behind had been bought by them. So these gentlemen could find no incriminating evidence, though they declared that accusations had been made by the natives. And then began another drama. American planes flew very low over the station, and were no doubt surprised at not seeing either the brethren or their pupils. The pupils were detained in their rooms. The Japanese then untied the prisoners and led them into a room where they were forced to sit absolutely still on the floor. They remained in that position until 11:30 a.m. The American planes circled round the houses all morning, and the Japanese were probably even more terrified than their prisoners. It was obvious that the Americans had seen the Japanese in the brethren's house, had realized the situation, and so did not want to drop their bombs. At about 11 a.m., the captain ordered one of the brethren to cook a meal, and Brother Ephraim was led to the kitchen with great ceremony. I do not know what the menu consisted of, but I do know that everyone was much strengthened by the meal. After the Americans stopped flying around, the Japanese gave their orders to the fathers and brethren. Do not leave the station. Do not even go into the grounds. Only the pupils may go into the grounds, etc. Then they departed with polite farewells. The next morning, Sunday, the American planes returned and destroyed both the Japanese boats. Apparently the Japanese, about 40 or 50 of them, are now on the height overlooking Makina, between Paruru and Makina. Yesterday, the 24th, 2 American planes flew over here at great speed, coming apparently from Marau and travelling westward, probably making for Vuru or Vioru. Also on 27th August, Gumu returned. Separated from the brush patrol during the firefight, he found that 3 survivors of the ambushed Japanese party were leading their battalion to the Tenaru, so he hid beside the track, using 10 stones to count the troops as they went by. When the main body had passed, Gumu crept up on a straggler, who was washing his feet in a stream. After disposing of the soldier, he departed with his boots and papers. On account of the battle, Gumu could not get through to Lunga, so he decided to find out what the Japanese were up to. Unfortunately, he ran into Ishimoto. Ishimoto had 4 soldiers with him, together with the 2 fathers and 2 of the sisters from Ruavatu. He tried to make Gumu carry his pack. When the scout said he was sick and could not do it, Ishimoto angrily hit him across the face. Knowing that he could not hit back, Gumu alertly suggested that the 3 Catholic natives who were with them could carry the packs. Ishimoto then let him go. At Makile, he met the survivor of 5 Solomon Islanders who had carried a wounded Marine back to the lines. The man had escaped, but Ishimoto and his squad had annihilated the other 4 with the bayonet. I gathered that Ishimoto took the missionaries back to Makile and then returned to join the main force attacking us. Gumu then headed for the police post at Koilo. He thought that there were a lot of Japanese wandering about, especially at Tasimboko, but that no new parties had landed. With our aircraft attacking enemy shipping in earnest, we had a few quiet nights, and 2 or 3 of our smaller vessels were able to elude the Japanese Navy and bring up some much-needed supplies. The only trouble was it was so quiet that we stayed awake wondering why. Japanese rice was now a prominent feature in our diet. We held a sweepstakes on the number of currants each man got with his rice. The constant activity, together with the meagre rations, burned up all my nervous energy, and I was often so tired that I could not sleep, even when I had the opportunity. As a change from my normal afternoon report compiling, on 29th August I had a great session with two visitors, Dick Horton and Henry Jocelyn, freshly arrived from Tulagi. Lucky devils, they were now sub-lieutenants in the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve. At least they thought so. They were wearing naval shoulder boards on their marine uniforms, though they were not quite sure whether their commissions had come through. Dick had a marmalade-coloured beard, and Henry a scraggy, sandy job. I rocked with laughter, but the joke was on me, for I had forgotten my own, which they found just as funny. They had had a great time scrapping on Tulagi with the raiders, and so were burning to do something more active, but they were not sure whether they would be allowed to carry on fighting with the Marines, or be used as reliefs for some of the other coast watchers. In addition, Walter H. Brooksbank, the civil assistant to the Royal Australian Navy's Director of Naval Intelligence, arrived at Lunga with Macfarlane's relief, Lieutenant Laurie Ogilvie, and there was much discussion and conferences with Colonel Buckley about the proper function of the Coast Watch. Next day I took 3 of the lads down to Kukum, where they were to join the 1st Raider Battalion when that unit came over from Tulagi. The Marines planned to have it execute a landing at Tassafaronga. One of the destroyer transports, Colquhoun, was lying close in to shore when the day's second air raid warning went. The Betis sneaked down in the eye of the afternoon sun and landed a couple on her stern. She went down clean as a whistle in under 3 minutes, and we had the ghastly job of picking up the oil-covered survivors, many of whom were dangerously wounded by the explosion of her depth charges, which had not been on safety. News arrived that the missionaries had been allowed to return to Ruavatu, although it was feared that that was only to collect their belongings. I assumed that Ishimoto was at the bottom of it all, and I was very worried about them. Sergeant Andrew had got in touch with the party, proposing to spirit them away and hide them at Parapau, but the fathers refused to disobey the Japanese, who had now been reinforced by the troops from Marau. It was some consolation that Leina, the former bosun of the cutter Lofung, had played the local idiot and carried the Marau party's machine gun up to Bokoagao so that he could keep tabs on them. From information at our disposal on 1st September, it was clear that another Japanese attack was pending. The Marines were not the strong force of the 7th of August. We had had a lot of casualties. Malaria was beginning to incapacitate units, and everyone had been working the 24 hours round. Since every Marine was needed for the front line, it was decided to try to get in some native labour if that was in any way possible. The labourers could relieve the Marines by unloading supplies, whenever supply ships managed to reach us through the Japanese naval ring and do many quartermaster jobs. Unloading drums of gasoline was a wearisome job, but it was one that the Solomon Islanders were used to from peacetime days, and they could do it speedily and efficiently. I sent out orders for the collection of a gang. I celebrated the first day of the new month by getting down to the Lunga River for a swim and a bath, which were much needed. The best technique, I soon found, was to sit in the river with my clothes on and, after having a good soak, to soap them all over. Then I took them off, anchored them with a big stone, and repeated the performance on myself. By the time I finished, my clothes were neatly rinsed and could be laid out to dry while I enjoyed a swim or just lying in the cool water. One of the old Japanese shacks near the Lunga River contained a portable iceworks. It was now operating again as Tojo Ice Factory divided by under new management, divided by J. Jinung, Sergeant, United States, Marine Corps. Must of the ice, went to the hospital, but occasionally we got a block by skillful arrangement through the souvenir net. As we had decided to get in native labour, and as the scouting organisation had expanded so greatly, I had to get a new camp area for my men and organise a proper rationing system. Because of the strict rationing, it was difficult to get enough rice for them, and, as we had no bread, did not find the rest of the marine rations very filling. The camp had to be accessible both to the front line, for getting the lads in, and to D2 so I could keep an eye on them, and yet be as far away from the airstrip as possible. None of them liked air raids. It was a tall order. On 2nd September, we sent the Grumman Duck over to Malaita to get the resident commissioner. It was not working very well, and when he came the following day, Mr. Marchant had a hazardous trip. He looked pretty skinny after his last few months in the bush, and his corduroy shorts were ripped from top to bottom, done in by the jet of water on landing. His pith helmet, or Bombay bowler, Struck quite a note, however. We had all got used to tin hats or to the liners. There followed long conferences with Colonel Buckley and the Australian naval people, straightening out the overlap of their setup with ours. It took hours to convince Mackenzie that, as I was still responsible for civil administration on Guadalcanal, the scouting net would have to remain my responsibility. In the end, however, it was agreed that it would be so, and that his function would be to gather information from the coast watchers in the islands that were still occupied. It worked much the best this way, as our scouting system was by now part and parcel of the D2 section, and all the scouts could now work in close cooperation with Marine units. For scouting purposes, we divided the island into 5 main sections, each containing a company of scouts. They were responsible not only for keeping us fully posted on the enemy's situation in their area, but also for rescuing and bringing back any of our pilots who might have crashed, and for bringing in as prisoners any stray Japanese who could be overcome by force of arms or by guile. Any marine patrols were to be passed through their territory and given every assistance. Gallant old Vuza, who had recovered completely, took over Tasimboko, the danger area. Greatly amused Colonel Buckley, who, in my absence, had asked him to bring in a prisoner. Vuza asked him when he wanted one. "Oh," said the colonel, "tomorrow will do." "What time?" Vuza asked. "Oh, about 10 o'clock, Buckley said. And sure enough, at 10 o'clock the next morning, Vuza arrived with a Japanese neatly trussed to a bamboo pole. On being taxed with cruelty, Vuza said that the man could not walk fast enough, so they had decided to carry him. Ammunition was badly wanted, and we were rather cross at the Navy for sailing off and leaving us alone. They had, of course, been pretty busy, but we knew nothing about it. And when we heard on the radio one night that they had been awarded some decorations, the Marines had a good old grumble. We all felt pretty lonesome during those days of no retreat and no apparent help. It all came down to, would we ever get off the island alive? If so, how? A morbid rumour started that the latest tune on the hit parade show was called Say a Prayer for a Pal on Guadalcanal. Captain Moran cheered everyone up by electing himself hero, self-appointed, and after that he always added hero, self-appointed to his signature. The first night of the resident commissioner's visit was fairly quiet, but that was apparently only politeness to visitors. A day later he was given a good example of Guadalcanal's evening entertainment. We had just settled down for the night when we were suddenly covered with dust from a salvo from 3 destroyers or cruisers. Our rickety marquee rocked and heaved and sustained further damage. The chief blow, however, was the loss of the destroyer transports Little and Gregory, which had returned a few hours before, with 2 companies of raiders from Savo. Some of our planes went up, but they saw nothing, as it poured with rain. We all got sopping wet. The day raids were not so bad, because Reed, Mason and Kennedy were giving us enough warning for our fighters to get into the air and intercept them. But at night, another nuisance had developed. It was an enemy scout plane, which, after gaining great height, shut off its engine and glided in over our area. The first that one would hear of his visit was his peculiar engine starting up again, followed immediately by the explosion of a solitary bomb. This quite often caused casualties, and always annoyed everyone. From the peculiar noise of his engine, he was soon christened Washing Machine Charlie, or more technically Maytag Charlie, after the popular brand in the States. After matters had been arranged to his satisfaction and he had experienced all manner of excitement and discomfort, the resident commissioner staggered back to Maleta in the Duck with a bag or 2 of supplies and a good idea of the luxurious life we were leading. I am glad to say he approved of what I was doing. Up to now we had heard very little from the Japanese beyond the Matanikau. Our patrol activities had been indecisive, and no line had been established. Then, on 6th September, a haggard marine fighter pilot turned up at the western perimeter. His name was Richard Amarine. Forced down in the water off Cape Esperance, Lieutenant Amarine had a hard time with the currents, which made him drift around in circles. Finally, he managed to creep ashore and hide behind a log. 2 Japanese were searching the bush for him. At dusk they gave up and, to his horror, sat down on his log for a rest. In his cramped position, the pilot's choice of plan was rather limited. He grabbed a rock and, raising himself as noiselessly as possible, bashed one man over the head. Luckily, he was the one with the pistol. Amarine was immediately set upon by the other, but, after a desperate struggle, finally strangled him. He had kicked off his shoes and trousers while swimming ashore. Reluctantly, he took the pants from one of his victims. The pistol had only 3 bullets in it. In due course, the lieutenant found an enemy soldier whose boots seemed about his own size, and with new footwear and 2 shots left, he continued on his way. Hundreds of Japanese went by, carrying quarters of beef, while Amarine hid, starving. Looking for coconuts near the beach, he saw what he thought was some natives. They turned out to be Japanese, and he had to use his second bullet to get away. Before reaching our lines, he was surprised by a Japanese sentry, who raised his rifle to his shoulder, only to be drilled by that precious third shot. Amarine came in suffering from sores, malnutrition, and shock. I saw him in the hospital. He was about to have his first good sleep in a week, but he insisted on telling us everything. Afterward, Colonel Buckley asked if he had anything to add. "Oh yes," Amarine said. "What a pity. If I had only had my net. Just think how many beautiful butterflies I could have caught." It turned out he had studied entomology at the University of Kansas. The 1st Raider Battalion, a specially trained unit, some of the officers and sergeants had completed Mountbatten's commando course at Inverare, in Scotland, had borne, along with the 1st Parachute Battalion, the brunt of the fighting on Tulagi and on Gavutu and Tanambogo. They were sent over to Guadalcanal for a rest, but the word rest had passed out of our vocabulary. The Raiders' commanding officer, Colonel Merritt A. Edson Red Mike, as he was known to his men, was a tough, shrewd leader who had developed his initiative against desperadoes in Nicaragua. He was a deadly shot and wore a pair of pearl-handled revolvers. Another accomplished soldier was Edson's executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Samuel B. Griffith II, with whom Dick Horton and Henry Jocelyn had become firm friends. We shared a shelter during a couple of air raids and batted the breeze about the fighting in Tulagi and about Inverare and Scotland. From scouting reports by Andrew and others on 31st August, appeared that most of the Japanese to our east were concentrated round Tasimboko. We had very little idea of their strength and dispositions, however, until 2 scouts, Celia and Vora, returned on 3rd September from a 3-day reconnaissance to that area. From their report, I concluded that there were about 300 enemy soldiers occupying strong defensive positions west of Tasimboko village. Colonels Twining and Thomas drew up a plan to land the raiders at Taivu Point and come in on the Japanese from the rear. At midday on 7th September, only hours before the force was due to depart, Vuza brought information that there were far more troops at Tasimboko than we had thought. I advised Buckley that there had been a sudden increase in the size of the garrison, and Edson might be facing 2,000 to 3,000 well-armed Japanese. The D2 staff, however, while conceding some increase in strength, had a low opinion of the enemy's combat readiness, and the operation proceeded as planned. That evening the raiders embarked in 2 destroyer transports and 2 patrol craft for the attack on Tasimboko. With them, over from Tulagi, was Dick Horton, who knew the area well. Celea and Olorare went along as guides, but I doubted the usefulness of scouts for amphibious operations, apart from locating the landing area. Vuza, who loved a scrap, had talked his way into going. I insisted that he not go ashore. Vuza returned on one of the destroyer transports late the next day. He had guided them into Taivu but had stayed on board. The raiders, enjoying both naval and air support, had surprised the rearguard of a large enemy force and destroyed a massive quantity of equipment, ammunition, and stores, which were stacked as if the Japanese had just arrived. Though most of their troops had already moved off into the bush, Edson estimated that no fewer than 4,000 men had very recently been at Tasimboko, and he came away with a healthy respect for the value of my scouts' intelligence. As Marines could not be spared, I sent Deacon a scouting party to destroy the rest of the Japanese equipment. Aerial photographs had revealed that division headquarters, with all the tracks leading to it, stuck out like a sore thumb. We had taken a lot of casualties there, from both bombing and shelling, and on 9th September, General Vandergrift ordered a move of his command post to a razor-backed hill, actually one spur of a long grassy ridge, about a mile south of Henderson Field. The lower slopes of the hill had convenient clumps of large trees, under which the division's various staff sections could be hidden. Looking back on it, this was a most inopportune time to move, as the Japanese obviously were preparing for something big. My scouts had reported that an enemy force of 5,000 men was moving through the jungle, south to southwest from Tetere, in an arc that would leave it in a commanding position in the hills south of the airfield. These were the troops Edson had missed at Tasimboko. To the west, the Matanikau line was growing more active, and forces of unknown size had landed in Rhodes's area. For 3 or 4 days it was absolute hell, digging in at the new command post by day, and then returning to the old area for the night. We were all exhausted when we started. I did not like the new site very much. It was far less accessible for my scouts, and the forward southern slope did not seem well protected. We were so busy with operations that I took the risk and kept as many scouts as possible at D2 to get our ops dugout completed. The one member of the section who had any pretensions toward either carpentry or engineering was a Marine named Barr, a strong, silent woodsman. He and the scouts worked day and night with a hammer, a Japanese saw, and a few picks and crowbars. There was not a flat piece of ground anywhere, and a floor had to be levelled for our rickety old marquee. At least it was well hidden by trees. In a morning bombing raid on 11th September, the Japanese laid a stick right on the ridge and nearly scuppered the road to the new command post. The nighttime shelling, it sounded like cruisers, started up again. This time it seemed they were trying to plaster the whole area, and the new command post in particular. I wondered why. The relocation of division headquarters was accompanied by a move of Edson's men to the southern part of the ridge. Ostensibly this was to provide them a rest area, for they had not had a night off since the August landings and were completely exhausted. Both his battalions were seriously under strength. The raiders were down to about 300, the parachutists even fewer, and many of those who were left had malaria or stomach trouble. In reality, however, the move was part of defensive preparations against a Japanese attack from the south against Henderson Field. On 12th September, with the command post in a half-finished state, the raiders were resting round about us. It was an uneasy rest, and the ever-alert Edson kept sending out patrols. That night his suspicions were justified. South of the command post, the raiders' forward positions were attacked by the Japanese. These were obviously not stragglers, but part of a well-organized force. There was a melee in the jungle on the right bank of the Lunga River, and one raider company got almost inextricably mixed up with a Japanese force. It took them till morning to unravel themselves and retire. Then an enemy cruiser and 3 destroyers opened up, and the whole thing became pandemonium. As if that were not enough, at 8 a.m., a jeep suddenly arrived from the 5th Marines down at Kukum with Reverend Stibbard and half a dozen native pupils, who had endured a 7-day bushwalk after the enemy had taken over his mission station at Maravovo. He was in a dreadful state, as they had neither eaten nor slept for 3 or 4 days, and 2 of his lads had been shot by the Japanese en route. Rowley, his offside, with whom Stibbard had temporarily separated, arrived with 5 other boys 2 hours later. I could hardly recognize him, with his shrunken face and his eyes popping out of his head. All I could do was give them 6 feet of floor space and tell them to lie down and stay down. After that, everything began to happen very quickly. It looked as if we were the mugs again. Edson, well up with the game and knowing we could not form a continuous defensive line, had his chaps digging strong points all afternoon. The remains of the parachute battalion were committed on his left, almost in the D2 section. At 4 p.m., a company of pioneers, apparently the only screen to the southwest between us and the river, withdrew through the command post before a large enemy force, believed to be at least 2,500 strong, that was advancing to the attack. The ridge on which the command post was being erected extended southeast about 1,400 yards before dropping steeply into the jungle. From the battle that ensued, it was given various names, but I always remember it as Raiders Ridge. It was impossibly steep for normal defense, and quite out of the question for maneuver. The headquarters camp commandant, Colonel Gannon, handed out more weapons to us chairborne types and ordered all my scouts into the command post defense line. This was indeed an honor, but it signified that the situation was extremely grave. Gloom was rampant, and we knew we were in for a dirty night. D2 was buzzing with messages, but everyone, when he had a chance, sneaked down to the ops dugout for a little determined digging. The raiders' line was less than 200 yards from us, and we were getting the Japanese overs. My post, which I shared with a paratroop captain, was just below the ops dugout, where the land fell steeply. A half-dozen scouts held the line in the jungle at the foot of the hill, covering a gap and trying to prevent infiltrators. Earlier that day, our artillery, which had been emplaced on the Matanikau front, had been hastily pulled up, and soon the registration shots were whistling directly over our heads. The shells only just cleared the treetops, one, coming in a bit too low, blasted off the top of a tree just above the scouts and about level with our dugout. They had a narrow escape. The sky was full of tracers, and mortar explosions lit up the trees. Our line fell back until it was just forward of the command post. Edson, lying on his belly only 10 yards behind the line of attack, directed the whole thing. We heard the Japanese yelling as they charged the raiders with bayonets. It was a hell of a night. Dawn broke to find the forest, our beautiful cover, a mass of leafless skeletons, mere firewood. A sigh of relief went up that we had withstood all that the Japanese had thrown at us throughout the night. But we had not reckoned with the snipers who had sneaked into our lines, and all that morning we had to operate on our bellies as bullets went whistling above. A loud bang revealed a sniper caught in what was to be General Vandegrift's new closet. Several attempts were made to get a scratch breakfast to the men, but every time a few of them collected to pick it up, somebody got winged by a sniper secreted in a thick glade right inside our position. My lads searched all day, and eventually got him. There were several suicide efforts. Near D1 administration and personnel, a Japanese officer dashed out in the clear morning light and cut a sleeping Marine to ribbons with his sword, before a Marine officer dispatched him. Another enemy soldier drew the attention of Marine gunner Sheffield Banter, who was calmly typing. As calmly, Banter pulled out his pistol, shot the Japanese dead, and so the story had it, went on with his work. It was a bit too hot for some of the newsmen, who were anxiously inquiring when the next boat would leave. A garrulous correspondent, whose name I did not get, arrived off a plane, saying that he had come all the way from London to get a story. I told him he had got here just in time. A bullet wanged past, and he only just got his head down. As he rammed his feet in my face, I discovered that he was wearing purple pajamas under his khakis. We found out nothing further about him, however, as he disappeared in the direction of the airfield and was not seen again. By 3:30 p.m., the last sign of resistance was over. We had lost an awful lot of men. Raiders and paratroopers sat around with hunched shoulders, faces grey and drawn, far too tired to speak. They were whacked to a standstill and could not have lasted much longer. A few lucky ones read their mail, which had come the previous day. The slope at the south end of the ridge was a ghastly mess. The Japanese had charged time and again, only to be repulsed, and there were dozens of them lying there in grotesque attitudes in death. There were Marines there too. Our artillery had arrived in the nick of time, for the Japanese had a considerable number of mountain guns, and they were just about to open fire when our first salvo landed on their batteries. We were very lucky. Their headquarters, which was hit early on, had been hurriedly evacuated, yielding up a rich haul of code books and other important information. It was evident that we had been attacked by almost a whole brigade. They had marched at least 20 miles to the ridge, manhandling their guns. Later we found out that the force landed at Tasimboko had been a strongly reinforced brigade of about 5,000 men, commanded by a General Kawaguchi. While we were busy on the ridge, one of their battalions attacked the strongly entrenched 1st Marines on the Tenaru and was badly mauled. A sortie against the 5th Marines on the western perimeter fared no better. The attempt to attack us on 3 sides at once had narrowly failed. The next 3 or 4 days were almost as bad as the battle, especially for us at D2. There was no time to recover and no respite, as we were hard at work analysing all the information and moving the command post back to our old spot. This time we dug in properly, but we still worked at Raiders Ridge and then trudged down the hill to sleep. Everyone was desperately hungry, as the cooks had been continuously on the move, and the occasional cup of coffee and some crackers were about all we could get. The naval shelling continued, but we were so tired that we turned over and went to sleep in spite of it. Too tired to write. I scribbled in my diary on 15th September. It was a dangerous state in which to be. We were in very poor condition. Expected reinforcements could not get in, and trouble sought us out at every turn. As if fighting for our own survival was not bad enough, signals poured in asking for assistance all round. Rhodes was in dire distress, but as the western end of Guadalcanal seemed to be filling up with Japanese, it was impossible to assist him. There was no news of the Ruavatu missionaries, and the mob at Gold Ridge was hungry again. At last, on 18th September, the 7th Marines managed to sneak in, bringing with them a good whack of supplies. We were terribly excited and licked our chops at the prospect of a square meal. After getting Stibbard safely away to Vila on the convoy, Rowley and the pupils would be sent to Bishop Badley on Maleta. I returned from the beach, only to find 2 more people to look after. One was Butcher Johnston, last seen going south in the Ruana. The other was John Mather. Mather, a great, big, cheerful chap who had been a planter in the islands, had been working with the Australian forces. They were to report to Colonel Buckley, but were not quite sure what they were supposed to do. Jono was in good form. When we got back to the old command post to sleep, he started looking a bit shifty and, fumbling in his pocket, whispered that he was in a dilemma. He had half a bottle of whiskey with him, but did not know what to do with it, as it would not suffice to give all the D2 officers a drink. After a whispered conference in the dark, he sidled up to the colonel and gave him a good slug. His duty done, we then sneaked off toward the latrines and had a good crack at what was left. It was my first drink of the real McCoy, and very good for morale. For the next few days I did not know whether I was on my head or my feet. There were countless different matters to deal with, and the operational situation got no better. The 7th Marines, who had taken over Raiders Ridge, were having sleepless nights with snipers and parties of stragglers. We also seemed to have drifted into intermittent action with the Japanese in the Matanikau area. It appeared to be a deadlock, for they held the commanding heights across the river, and none of the Marine units could get across without casualties. This situation involved me in the problem of how to get an attacking force round the enemy's landward flank. Unfortunately, most of the land to be traversed was trackless virgin bush, and very few scouts knew anything about it. Then Ironi arrived. He had sneaked through the fracas in his tiny launch with Captain Marion Carl, a Grumman pilot, as passenger. Carl, one of our leading aces, had come down in the water off Iola and been rescued by Ironi's men. It was arranged for Ironi to take Private First Class Harry M. Adams, a Marine radio operator who had been working with Mackenzie, to Moreau. There, the two of them were to run another coast watching post with a special lookout for enemy submarines, which had begun to turn Moreau into a torpedo corner. There was a slight hold-up over Ironi's departure, and a certain amount of soreness, as Mackenzie not only had been annoying about giving the necessary assistance, I had been so busy that I did not have stores ready for Ironi to take with him, but also had failed to get permission for Adams to go, and that rubbed Colonel Buckley the wrong way. The two men finally departed on 21st September. Snowy Roads was having an awful time. With the Japanese spread all over North Guadalcanal, he had packed up and flitted to Tangarare, the more southerly Roman Catholic mission station. On the way, he had run into Bishop Orbin, whose headquarters at Visail had been occupied by the enemy. The Japanese had elbowed the missionaries out of the way and forced them to seek refuge in the bush. In accordance with the bishop's neutrality policy, the Catholics had not hidden any stores, and the Japanese had smartly confiscated everything. As a result, the bishop had nearly died from dysentery, and his whole party was in a very weak state. Another little job I had to attend to was to lecture the 7th Marines the following evening. Colonel Buckley had asked me to go and chat with their colonel about night tactics and noises, as his men were spooked by opossums in the trees. They sounded like snipers, and their jittery shooting kept other units tense too. When I arrived, I was alarmed to find all the officers and some of the non-commissioned officers drawn up on a grassy bank under the trees. Though quite unprepared, for a few moments I was bereft of speech. I managed to say something apposite, and ended by making them laugh. They kept asking questions for another hour. I hope it did them some good. The air boys were having a great time round the north end of Guadalcanal, bombing and strafing landing craft and dumps of supplies. The Japanese were definitely building up in that area, and we could not stop them. There was even an enemy party on the north end of Maleta. I helped John Mather to make up a plan for attacking it that would give Bengo a chance to participate. We had at last stopped moving backward and forward, and had settled at the old command post. As there had been no air raids all day, John and I did the work lying on our stomachs in a slight depression on top of the coral ridge above D2. This, much to his embarrassment, had been christened Martha's Hole. On the second day after he arrived, the air raid warning went, and John, in his breezy way, sauntered up to the top of the ridge and said, "I think I will have a deco at what goes on from here." "No, you well do not," I replied. "You jolly well come down here." After some rude banter, Martha eventually climbed down and joined us below ground. During the raid, bombs fell all round, and after it was over we had the greatest pleasure in showing him the hole that had been made by a light anti-personnel bomb on exactly the spot he had chosen. He stood and looked at it for about 10 minutes, his mouth open in shocked amazement. On 23rd September, Colonel Puller and his battalion set off to try to outflank the Japanese at Matanikau. Puller, a fellow pipe smoker, naturally appealed to me. He was a tough old soldier, and if anyone could get round the Japanese, he was the man. Pelly went with them, and later Celia went out with the raiders. The scouts were getting pretty thin on the ground, as they were attached to operations on both our eastern and our western sides, and there was still all the normal coverage to do outside the perimeter. Dick Mangrum, now a lieutenant colonel, called to see us that afternoon, as there was no alert and his planes did not have to scatter. He brought with him a senior officer, Colonel Charles L. Fike, the executive officer of MAG-23 and Mangrum's SBD wing commander. The colonel appeared greatly interested in the Solomon Islanders. One of his many questions unintentionally raised a laugh. He asked me whether they had been able to write before the advent of the white man. I replied, quite unwittingly, that they could not have done so as they had no paper. Colonel Buckley and the D2 watch nearly burst themselves laughing. "He has got you there, oh Colonel," they said, and I am certain that our guest was never quite sure whether I had pulled his leg or not. Mangrum told us the air boss, General Geiger, was tearing out his hair over a new dive-bombing squadron. The squadron had attacked the enemy's nightly destroyer resupply runs off Cape Esperance, but had not much to show for it. When the destroyers returned on 24 September, the SBDs once more attacked, again with little results, and the old brigadier, shaking in his camp chair with rage, told the pilots to keep going out until they had sunk something. They went at it again and again, badly damaging 2 ships and forcing the others to turn back from their destination. For a couple of days it was relatively quiet, and Art Claffey and I went over to Henderson Field to return Mangrum's visit. By the side of the runway the Japanese had left a small hillock, on top of which they had erected a wooden shack with a traditional-style roof. This, duly christened the Pagoda by the Marines, and became Air Ops. Beside it was the radar van, which, owing to its unfortunate habit of warning us of a raid 10 minutes after it occurred, had given rise to the expression, "Go on, someone," or by the radar boys a cream puff. They had a shaky bamboo mast that could just be seen from D2. When enemy planes were in the area, they hauled up a Japanese flag, and it was condition yellow. When you saw someone rush out, haul down the red and white, and if he had time, haul up the black flag. It would be condition red, which meant that planes were overhead. Incidentally, if you were not a damned fool, you were underground by now anyhow, having seen them overhead yourself. It was nice to see so many aircraft scattered round the strip. I was especially interested in the torpedo bombers. They were called Avengers, but owing to their shape and the fact that they carried their torpedoes inside the plane, some wag had described them as pregnant dormice. For the next 2 weeks there was a lull in the land fighting east of the Matanikau, as organised enemy units had been either exterminated or thrown back in considerable disorder. Our job, therefore, was to repel boarders and stop the Japanese from landing more fighting units on the island. This was not so easy, as they had temporarily abandoned the remains of Kawaguchi's force to the east and were busy consolidating to the west and north. We could keep the seas covered with our planes during the day, but the Japanese had many methods of sneaking troops in during the night. They had landing craft bases hidden at different points from Bougainville down to Guadalcanal. On the lines of Grandmother's Footsteps, their barges would pop out as soon as it was dark and make one stage farther south along the Sound, whose waters became known as the Slot. Kennedy and Cooper were kept busy trying to locate these boat stages. The Japanese also used fast destroyers and even cruisers to sweep close in to shore and land their troops, who were cast over the side, together with sealed drums full of rice, and left to swim ashore. This sort of thing was difficult to detect. Our naval strength was not such that we could risk battles with this nightly service, known by us all as the Tokyo Express, and consequently we were wide open to being shelled. The enemy warships would drop their human cargo near Cape Esperance, steam down at high speed, throw a couple of salvos at us, and disappear again, out of range of our dawn patrol. The Japanese to the east were mostly wandering about in search of food, which worried the islanders. In order to preserve their sense of martial superiority, they would attack us at night. The uncertainty of their activities kept the Marines, in large numbers, on the alert 24 hours round the clock. None of us got very much rest, but we were able to get some semblance of order restored at D2. We actually got a new tent with a raised wooden floor made of Japanese bedboards and were still busy digging a proper dugout for the duty crew. Each morning everyone would start working on it, but as the day wore on, Marines and Scouts would gradually be drawn off for other jobs, and Tabasui, who had now become an assistant quartermaster, would be left to work on his own. He adopted the job cheerfully, and soon became clerk of the works, foreman and labour force, all rolled into one. All the Marines used to stop by and razz him, but without him we would never have got the job done. Mackenzie and Horton had been labouring away at a similar task. They were very proud when they finished theirs first, and the two of them dragged me out of bed to go and christen their new toy with a hell brew made of ethyl alcohol tempered with grapefruit juice. After a death-defying jeep ride down the muddy edge of the airfield in the pitch dark without lights, we arrived safely underground, and the honours were done. What a drink! It was lucky that Washing Machine Charlie was having a rest that night. I eventually got back safely to D2 without getting lost, much to the annoyance of everyone I stumbled over in the dark. During this lull, I managed to get my scouting organisation brought up to date and put on a regular pay basis. As many of the men were in other parts of the island, and obviously could not be brought in, Daniel Puhle did most of the hard work, writing notes to all the section leaders to get the nominal roles completed. My education in American slang and customs was developing with the assistance of the enlisted men at D2. I no longer asked whether breakfast was ready, I merely said, "When's chow?" I also found out that when it was ready, the master cook would announce, "Chow is down, not duff is up," as in the British Army. The sergeant major of the headquarters company was a hatchet-faced Brooklyn native called Hank Moran. To start with, I could not understand a word he said. When I called to find out if my scouts were being adequately fed, Moran would tell me, "We's cooking with gas on the front boiler." This indicated that things were going well. I threatened to start a front boiler club. Then there were the particularly Marine expressions, linked in many cases with their great tradition. The greatest of these was the word. Some of the earliest Marines had continued to shoot from the maintop of John Paul Jones's flagship long after everyone else had given up. Their excuse afterward was that no one had passed the word. Hence you asked what the word was, on reinforcements arriving, for example, or when we were going to be relieved. If it was merely the latest rumour you were inquiring about, however, or the latest figures for Japanese at Tasimboko, you said, "What is the scuttlebutt?" or "What is the dope?" It probably originated at the head, the Marine term for latrine. Following the nautical vein, senior officers would wave you into their bell tent from the mud outside with, "Happy to have you aboard, sir." Someone would make a naive inquiry such as, "You Marines serve on board ship, don't you?" The reply would be, "Hell, yes." Or, if someone asked them if they had anything to do with the army, the reply would be, "Them? Hell, no." The way they said it exhibited their pride in their corps. It had bags of expression. We also had the more local forms of American to deal with. There was the boy from Okefenokee, who told me in his Elizabethan drawl that his captain done gone went to headquarters. Then there was Wimpy Wendling from Kentucky, who told us all about shilling on the stump moonshine. During the frequent periods of waiting for attacks, we had plenty of time to bat the breeze. In the circle one night was Lieutenant Colonel Twining, who had taken over Operations D3 as Thomas had been promoted to colonel and become general, Vandegrift's chief of staff. We had been discussing the well-worn topic of colonialism in America, and had just about got the Boston Tea Party put on a paying basis, when Twining suddenly cut up rough. "What is the matter, Bill?" Colonel Buckley asked. "It was our goddamn tea they threw in the harbour," Twining replied in injured tones. On another occasion, it took us some little time to convince the Wisconsin native that they grew apples in California. My little black dog with the funny prick ears, Suino, had been grand company in the bush. As I could not leave him behind, he had joined the Marines, and had got more or less used to military life. He would trot at my heels when we were on foot. But when I was jeep-borne, he preferred to balance aggressively on the flat bonnet. As for air raids and bombardments, he soon learned to sense danger. Like everyone else, when we got Kennedy's morning message, for example, 22 Bettys, yours 1,100, meaning that 22 bombers would be over us in, say, 20 minutes. He would seek out the nearest tree, do his business, and be ready to go down below as soon as condition red was sounded. The detonations of bombs or shells used to hurt his ears, and the poor creature would sit in my lap, whimpering gently, and let me hold my hands over them. On patrol, however, he was usually the first to sense danger, and if there were Japanese within 200 yards, he would pause like a pointer, his hackles would rise, and he would emit an almost soundless growl. He was a fine companion, and most of the Marines were quite prepared to put up with him. It was not long before he was christened Suey, the Jeep Hound. Someone, in a flash of brilliance, suggested that eating fish would make up for the lack of fresh stuff in our diet. There was nothing wrong with the idea, but to catch a regular supply of fish for 15,000 men under frontline conditions was a major operation. I paid a visit to the Beachmaster, Commander Dexter, of the Coast Guard. He was quite keen, and we decided to do some experimental trolling from a landing craft. It was with a certain amount of misgiving that we went down toward Matanikau 3 days later. I felt that we were being watched by 1,000 eyes, and if the engine stopped, the Japanese would be only too eager to dispatch us. Fortunately, we got back all right. Unfortunately, we caught nothing, because the boat was too fast and noisy, and there was oil on the water from the many ships that had been sunk in the neighborhood. We decided that hand grenades thrown into the water whenever shoals of fish appeared would fill the pot much quicker. For this purpose, the grenades were designated Naval spinners. The lull enabled us to get all available scouts out checking the state of the Japanese to the east. After a bit we had a pretty clear picture, but it seemed that the only static lot was the party at Gorobusu. This consisted of the 50 men who had settled at Taivu Point, and who, just before the Marines arrived, had sailed down to Marau, where they had interrogated the Catholic fathers and brothers. After their lugger was sunk, they had walked up the coast, accompanied by my scout Leina, who was still keeping an eye on them. The party was still in radio contact with the Japanese Navy, and it was not beyond the bounds of possibility that they were being contacted from time to time by submarine. It was decided that they should be put out of action, together with any other small parties in the area. The troops would come from Tulagi. I was to be responsible for scouting out the details, for getting our force into contact with the Japanese, and for supplying the necessary scouts and carriers. On Sunday, 27th September, Colonel Buckley and I were sitting outside D2, quietly discussing the Gorobusu do with Colonel Arthur, whose Marines were slated for the job. Suddenly, the quiet of that peaceful afternoon was rudely shattered by Japanese planes, which scattered a mass of anti-personnel bombs throughout our area. We dove for our new dugout just in time, and when we emerged we found that bombs had gone off on either side of us, only 20 yards and 24 yards away. One had made holes through everything in our operations tent, including our beautiful, up to the minute information maps and the colonel's cot, which had already suffered on several previous occasions. The other bomb had landed 3 yards from where the door of our tent had been. Our gear, camp beds, bedboards, and tent had been blown back against the coral ridge and smashed to smithereens. Of the 8 officers using the tent, most lost everything. What we collected hardly filled half a kit bag. Of my gear, all I salvaged was a small haversack full, together with my 3 volumes of Shakespeare and my diary, which were badly splintered. 3 red-hot pieces of jagged metal had entered the bottom of my kit bag and gone systematically through everything, ending up in a canvas mendal at the other end. Everything had to be thrown away, but I kept a handkerchief that had been in the path of the shrapnel. When unfolded, it displayed a charming lacework pattern. I thought I had saved my bedding roll, but the kapok mattress was full of hot splinters, and after 20 minutes it was on fire. What hurt me most was the loss of 2 good pipes, and my Royal Australian Air Force wide-awake hat. They were irreplaceable. As we had no warning, we were very lucky that no one in the section was annihilated, but the officers now had no tent, no floor, no nothing, just a big hole. The kunai grass, which had been 18 inches high where it was not trampled, had been shaved off close to the ground as clean as a whistle for 50 yards on either side. As a final insult, there remained but 2 articles on our telephone wire wash line. These were a pair of knee-length woolen stockings, to wear with shorts which I had acquired from a departing correspondent and which I had just washed. They had been sheared off about 6 inches above the ankle, and the feet were nowhere to be found. Jolly mean, I called it. We were all highly indignant. It was Sunday too. There were more than 50 planes, which had come over in 2 waves. Our only satisfaction was that the bombers were thoroughly shot up by the Grummans, and several did not get back. By some mischance of fate, Iranian Private First Class Adams had not yet got to Marau to open up the anti-submarine radio watch. They had set out in Irani's launch, but it was grossly overloaded, and they were forced to return. I then got a landing craft under our Coast Guard coxswain, Ray Evans, to escort them to Iola. Adams set up the wireless there. It was my old set, carried down from Parapau, but it would not work, so he had to bring it in for repairs. Bingiti brought him up in the small launch. Evans returned to Iola with Adams and the repaired set, together with 5 raiders, under Sergeant Pettus, whom we had borrowed from Colonel Edson. They had orders to make a preliminary reconnaissance of the Japanese at Gorobusu, and, as we could contact them through Adams, do any specific scouting jobs that we might find necessary. Thus, unknowingly, Adams and my old set became the nucleus of our second line of defense, based on the cadets' house behind the station. On 1st October, Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific, Sin Si Pak, as he was known telegraphically, who had flown in the night before in a flying fortress, held a formation at General Vandergrift's hut at 6:30 in the morning. Everyone was very pleased to see him, and we got the idea that he was quite pleased with the Marines' performance. The Admiral started by pinning a Navy cross onto General Vandergrift's breast. The General went quite pink in the face, and appeared fair dumbfounded. It seemed he knew nothing about it. Colonel Edson got a Navy cross for Raiders Ridge, Colonels Cates and Pollock for the Tenaru. The airboys were well represented. Colonel Mangrum was awarded the Navy Cross for the huge tonnage of shipping he and his men had sunk under such trying conditions. Major Smith, the leading fighter ace, Major Gaylor, the commanding officer of VMF 224, and Captain Carl, who would have equalled Smith's performance had he not had to spend a few days with Eroni at Iola, were similarly decorated. Everyone was in combat dress with helmets, except for the Admiral, who wore the standard combination cap, and the fighter boys, who had on the dark blue baseball caps that they wore in the air. As for Rhodes, his position was getting wusser and wusser. He and Schroeder were both suffering from malarial fever, and with Bishop Orbin and his party also at Tangarare, their food situation was pretty bad. Snowy had no freedom of movement. He was liable to be picked up at any time, so he could not give us much useful information. I managed to arrange for a Catalina to go round and rescue them, but the trip had to be cancelled a couple of times owing to a shortage of planes for reconnaissance. Following these delays, the bishop started agitating to have the fathers and sisters evacuated as well. This put me in a very awkward position, as he had previously refused to evacuate and had promised me that he would not call for help. Now, when we had practically no facilities for this sort of thing, I had to go and ask General Vandergrift to divert combat material to get him out. The general, quite rightly, was infuriated that we had to consider a rescue mission in the middle of a war. "A goddamn bunch of nuns," he kept muttering. Rhodes's last signal, however, sounded a note of urgency. Bishop requests also evacuation of native nuns, as if left behind will be dishonoured. That tipped the scale in the prelate's favour, and another Catalina was approved. Then we discovered that Mackenzie, unbeknownst to anybody and without authority, had arranged with Bengoff for the Ramada to go and pick up Rhodes, Schroeder and Bishop Orbin and his party. This was even more confusing. Now the general would think that Mackenzie and Bengoff intended to land the missionaries at Lunga and leave the rest to him. He saw red, and Colonel Buckley and I had to take Mackenzie in to be hauled over the coals. As the Ramada had already left Malaita, the Catalina was cancelled. The schooner was unarmed. Her sides and awnings were painted black and grey, respectively, and she was marked with 2 white crosses for identification. Ramada's diesel engine gave her a speed of 6 knots. She was captained by Peter Sassenbuhl, one of the senior native skippers, who could find his way blindfolded into almost every anchorage in the Solomons. He arrived on 3rd October with 3 Japanese in custody, whom Bengoff had picked up from a crashed airplane. 2 of Bengoff's lads, Baithisara and Tome, remained on board as guards until I could transport them. Peter was not at all keen when he heard what his orders were, but he was slightly reassured when told that Dick Horton would accompany him. The trip was rather risky. As they had to go past so much enemy-occupied territory, they headed out into the open channel early in the afternoon with the intention of making a horizon circle, and with one of our fighter planes keeping an eye on them. They had been gone only 2 hours when Kennedy signaled that 6 Japanese destroyers had been spotted about 140 miles away. This meant that the enemy would be at the north end of Guadalcanal by 4 a.m. The Dauntlesses and Avengers, though not equipped for night flying, kept going out until well after dark. They harried the Japanese quite successfully, and early next morning Snowy signalled that the Ramada had arrived safe and unharmed. With enemy destroyers in the vicinity, we kept our heads pretty low that night but did not receive the expected shelling. The troops they had landed, no doubt, would attack us at some later date. When we were lucky enough to expect shelling, as opposed to being blown out of bed by it, I had the technique wrapped up. Taking a waterproof cape to lie on, I would turn in on the parapet of our dugout and when either we got the word or the first salvo exploded, or a star shell illuminated the scene, I would roll almost automatically over the brow. If awake, I would make my way into the dugout. If still comatose, I would get swept in by the crowd. While we were getting Horton and the Ramada away, a signal came in that McFarlane, at long last, was coming to join us. The following morning a truck arrived with several scouts. They had a white man with them, but he was not the one we were expecting. Mac had had a touch of malaria, and the party had proceeded without him. They brought a United States Navy flyer, Bill Warden, who had made a forced landing in the slot near Isabel on 7th August. Taken south by the current, he fetched up in the Russell Islands, luckily at a different bay from that occupied by the Japanese. A few days later he paddled across to the northwest coast of Guadalcanal, where friendly islanders brought him to Rhodes, and he was taken in by Father de Klerk at Tangaroa. The Japanese were starting to close in, and Warden, having recovered from his privations on Catholic chicken and pineapple, felt it his duty to report for service. Against all advice, he walked to Gold Ridge, rigged up in Father de Klerk's rather clerical clothes. It was no wonder that when he arrived no one could recognize him. As the scouts had managed to avoid meeting any enemy troops, and as they had brought in some carriers, I got busy collecting rations to go back to the hungry hunters at Gold Ridge. Later, the Ramada returned safely with snowy roads, well-bearded. Leif Schroeder, a rescued airman. Bishop Albar, dressed in white and clasping his umbrella. 6 priests, 6 European nuns, and the native nuns. Our supply ships, having run the gauntlet of the Japanese Navy, were offloading fuel and supplies and unloading hospital cases and prisoners as fast as they could. Landing craft went busily back and forth from the shore, and the screening destroyers steamed silently up and down the channel. Into the midst of this activity came the tiny Ramada, loaded to the waterline with her heterogeneous cargo. As they dropped anchor, the fighter plane that had escorted them dipped low in salute to a good job, well done. We were standing by in a landing craft to direct unloading, and soon we had the fathers scrambling up the bosun's ladder onto the Fommelhaut, one of the cargo ships. Next were the sisters who, in spite of the climate, were in typical nuns' robes. In any case, most were of such an age as made it impossible for them to go up the bosun's ladder. After a lot of shouting and waving of arms, the little mailboat was lowered, and the nuns transferred to it. It was then smoothly hauled up the tall side of the ship by block and tackle, to the resounding cheers of all around. As the boat reached the deck, the anchor came up, and the convoy slipped away into the gathering darkness. The native nuns remained on the Ramada overnight. At D2, we sarcastically speculated whether they were really safer with Sasambule and his crew than they would have been with the Japanese. While Rhodes and company were swept away by Mackenzie, I took Bishop Aubin to call on General Vandergrift. The general had worked up a good head of steam. When the bishop arrived, however, his wrath evaporated. The poor man, who had undergone great privations, looked haggard and emaciated, and on his last legs. General Vandergrift could not help but be kind to him. He greeted the bishop with the greatest courtesy, poured a generous dram of Old Crow, and even managed, as I had daringly urged him, not to mention the bunch of nuns. The bishop stayed the night. Bright and early in the morning, we got him and the native sisters off to Malayata in the Ramada, en route picking up Rowley and his pupils, who had got as far as Tulagi. Thus was satisfactorily completed Operation Bunch o' Nuns. Since the beginning of October, the weather had changed. We had several days of heavy rain, during which the whole area was turned into a sticky bog of black mud. It made life in our sleeping quarters intolerable, but whenever we could, we got down to the Lunga River and washed it all away. There was no rest for the wicked. I provided detailed instructions for Evans, who had to go and pick up the Raider Recce party from Iola. Once the Japanese attacked us from the west, it would be a fight to the death, and we might not be able to spare anyone for operations like Gorobusu. Then the carriers for Gold Ridge had to be got away. Poor old Mackenzie, who was just as overworked as we were, got very snappy because they had to leave before he had got his letters ready for Hay, who was to continue to operate McFarlane's tele-radio as an air warning post at Gold Ridge. Back at D2, Rhodes and Schroeder gave us their information on the occupied northwest. We made them put it on our map while 2 stenographers took down everything they said. Snowy had had a rough time, with malaria and stomach problems into the bargain. He was in poor shape, but he had certainly earned his keep. We did not vote him many marks for his beard, however, as although it had grown well, it was part blonde and part grey. Although he had lost a lot of weight, The addition of a khaki-topped naval cap gave Snowy a jaunty air, and he cut a great figure when I took him to call on the general, who congratulated him on his work. Not to be outdone, McFarlane, accompanied by 4 scouts, Deke, Vura, Tabasui and Seppo, finally came in from Gold Ridge at 4:30 p.m. on 5th October. He was dressed in his fin de siècle whites, but the piece de resistance was his terrific black beard. In Australian slang, it was a real boomer. Mac got a wonderful reception, and it was definitely old home week at D2 as he, Snowy, and I got down to swapping our experiences. The next day, while we were busy getting the 2 of them suitably clothed, the reconnaissance party returned from Iola with splendid coverage of Gorobusu and the 2 or 3 other small Japanese posts nearby. Legu also reported in, having patrolled as far as Coley Point with a company of Cates's Marines. As expected, they had met few enemy troops, since most of the Japanese were well off the coast. To complete the picture, John Mather, who had managed to get across to Malaita in the Grumman Duck after about 6 false starts, returned at last with a master plan for putting the Japanese there out of action. He had done his best to explain to Bengo how things were with us, but it did not stop the latter from writing me a note casually, asking me to send him over 1,000 cigarettes. As the 27 of us at D2 had carefully shared out 200 between us the day before, and we were lucky to get them, I wondered whether Bengo thought I was a magician. The Japanese efforts to build up their forces on Guadalcanal for another attack had been unremitting. There was no doubt that something pretty solid was looming. One positive development in the situation was that our air force was becoming much stronger, and the daily raids of between 15 and 30 enemy bombers were regularly losing a significant number of planes. We had no need to exaggerate the number of aircraft shot down, as Reed, sitting close to their home airfield, used to let us know how many got back the same evening. Since 7th August, Japanese losses in the air had amounted to 300 or 400 planes. Although the Japanese planes continued to hammer away at Henderson Field, they were beginning to show an interest in mowing us down too. Every now and then a group of Zeros would zoom in at low level and let fly with explosive bullets all over the shop. If they thought they were lowering our morale, they were wrong. If anything, they raised it. You could not do that sort of thing to Marines without inviting a reply. Everyone opened up with whatever they had, rifles and machine guns, and even we at D2 would dash out and bang away with our pistols as the Zeros dived across no higher than the top of the coconut trees. Hell yes! It was a highly dangerous sport, but there is no doubt that it paid off, for quite often a Zero would crash through the palms, untouched by our bigger guns, and hit the ground with a satisfying thump. I used to enjoy it most when I was down at the naval base. I would sit with my back to a coconut tree and take them from left to right with a Tommy gun as they strafed the plantation house at Kukum, which was Commander Dexter's headquarters. Dexter himself had a monster weapon, well dug in and protected by sandbags. It was a 3-barreled Japanese machine gun, a veritable Chicago piano, and until the ammunition ran out, it did great service. My education in American slang was added to by the arrival of Snowy Rhodes. He kept talking about the bush, going into the bush, hiding in the bush, etc., and Colonel Buckley said to him one day, "Hey, Snow, what is all this bush?" Snowy, in quite serious vein, described at length the country behind Lavoro. The colonel laughed and said, "Oh, you mean the boondocks." The term boondocks was apparently used fairly generally in America for unimproved ground. Thus, by extension, boondockers were boots specially made for pioneering, and to go boondocking was to make a bush trip. Rhodes, completely stumped, pulled his pipe out of his mouth and sat eyeing the colonel suspiciously. In return, Snowy obtained the everlasting admiration of the Marines for the delightful intonation he gave to a much-used Australian word. He would tell a long tale of the iniquities of the Japanese in his area, and at the end, raising his eyebrows slightly, he would softly mutter, "Stupid." Everyone at D2 practiced it for days. McFarlane, Rhodes and Schroeder were to be sent off on leave via Tulagi when opportunity offered, as none was in good shape, and it looked as if life was going to be pretty tough. They had had their share. The pressure of work at D2 was relentless, however, so, wearily waving them goodbye, we got down to it again.